Clear.
Merci, Bossière Divine. Merci beaucoup à vous. C'était un plaisir d'être là, vous accompagner avec quelques notes de musique. Ça a été un grand plaisir pour moi de partager ce moment avec vous. Avec ce charmant public,
Merci Ousmane, merci Ousmane.
Merci.
Merci Ousmane, merci.
Merci à toi.
Yeah, so thank you Ousmane. Just to say, Ousmane, known as Ouskora, is an artist, a growing artist who is based in Senegal and comes from a very long tradition and family of choral musicians and singers. And Ousmane was supposed to be at Huma last year as a musician in residence, and we are hoping that the coronavirus would allow Ousmane to be with us again next year, all through the year as artist in residence. So thank you very much, Ousmane. Merci, Ousmane.
Merci à toi, frère.
Yeah, merci beaucoup, merci. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen and everybody, welcome to this very important event, which is the launch of today's Ethical Humanitarianism's seminar series. We are really happy, to have a number of colleagues who are going to join us, at this event today. Before we move on, I'm going to ask my colleague Kweku Ahin Sam. Kweku, if you're here, with whom we have collaboration, so he can at least introduce and welcome colleagues and introduce his institute, before we continue. Kweku, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Divine. Welcome to all of you. And thank you, Ousmane, for the wonderful melody that you gave to us. So as Divine said, this is a very important occasion, and we are happy that you could all make it this evening. We are launching the Ethical Humanitarian series today. And as you can see, or you saw from Divine's screen, this series is a cooperation between the Friedensau Institute for Evaluation, which is located in Friedensau Adventist University in Germany. The institute, we are involved in supporting humanitarian work and humanitarian interventions through evaluations, technical support in areas of WASH projects, education, agriculture. We support emergency as in humanitarian aid projects as well. We conduct both ex-ante evaluation and post-ante evaluations. And we do offer also capacity training to organizations, NGOs, and philanthropists. And our partnership with Huma is a very important one to us, because we see it as an opportunity to extend the discussion that is prevalent in our area of study, our area of research, and of course, our practical approaches as well. And most importantly, to combine it with the lens of ethics. And let me take the opportunity to welcome some personalities from our university here. So we have our Chancellor, Tobias Koch is here joining. Also, we have some professors from the Faculty of Social Sciences. Daniel Bendix is here, Ulrike Schultz is also there, and many of the students from the university are also here. So Divine, I think this is a very short introduction about the Institute. You can know more about us, of course, if you go to fife.institute. There's more about what we do. And we are very, very happy about this collaboration. And I think now Divine will introduce Huma to us as well. So Divine, please take over.
Thank you, Kweku, for that good introduction. So my name is Divine Fu. I am the director of HUMA. HUMA is the Institute for the Humanities in Africa. It's located in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Cape Town. HUMA was founded in 2010 as a space for interdisciplinary research, but also taking on board a very broad view of the humanities that encompasses, both STEMs and the SSH. It's also a place for encounters, and a space that establishes very strong connections with different institutes around the world, which take on questions of the human, at the core of their work. We like to say that we take South Africa to the world and bring the world, to South Africa. We also like to say that we are a Pan-African institute with an Afropolitan outlook. And that our work is guided by the question of being a human. Amongst our objectives, is to provide an intellectual leadership in an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research into key issues in the humanities and the human in Africa, to contribute to nurturing the next generation of scholars in the humanities, and to promote collegial work, in intellectual linkages and intellectual production, and to also create a space, to invigorate independent and also critical public conversation. So public engagement is a really key part of our work. The seminar series or series of discussions that we are starting today on the project, which is a collaboration with FIFE, is actually born out of our own thinking. So just to emphasize that this is not a funder-driven a project or initiative. This is a project that is born out of our own, initiatives, as an institute. Today, we were going to start today by paying homage, to a friend of ours who passed away, several years last year, and I think Naomi Steer was a really good friend and colleague, and a very strong humanitarian. We met together in Basel. She moved on to be the first president of the Omudili Foundation, and really contributed enormously, to knowledge production on the continent, and to nurturing, a really a new group of young scholars, and she's got a wide range of training, drama being a really key part of our own work. She worked in HIV and really worked across the continent, and that's also why we thought that bringing in music, from Mali and West Africa, where she had spent a lot of her time, would be really a key for this project. And the launch of this series on humanitarian work, I'm sure she would be smiling, seeing that some of us are pushing, this project and some of the initiatives that she, had started. We also thought that we would dedicate, this series of events or discussions also to many of the victims of the coronavirus, of COVID-19, and many of the people who have died and people who have lost people, in the past years. Also people who've lost their lives, to conflicts across the continent and across the world, in the past years. People who've lost lives, to violence, particularly, the gender-based violence that is consuming many parts of the world, currently. But also that we would dedicate this, to many of the front lines and essential workers whose lives are put on the line. To make sure that our lives, should continue. I think all through 2020, many people have discovered, especially in academia, that being a professor does not make you a frontline worker, or that having lots of books at your in front of you really does not make you a frontline worker. The day before yesterday, as we all know, Cape Town was consumed by fire, and the University of Cape Town was affected really deeply. And one of the buildings that consumed fire, the African Studies, a library, which is a really symbolic space, for many people, in the humanities and also across the world, and also given the fight push that we are making, for Africa-centered knowledge, and African knowledge production. When a building that houses a lot of African knowledge and brings together African people catches flame, it's very symbolic and very powerful. And I think it's important that we also remember and acknowledge many of the people who put their lives, on the line to ensure that, this fire, should be put out. Without much ado, I'm going to move on to introduce some of our eminent speakers today. We have 3 speakers who will be leading today's conversation. That's Lucy Kirkling from the University of Basel. And we also have is Carl Amandlan, who is here. Is Carl here? Yes, Carl is here. Carl Amandlan from the EcoBound Foundation. And we also have Catherine Toure. Is Catherine here? I'm looking for Catherine. Where is Kathleen? Catherine. Where is Catherine? Amina, can you?
Salut, salut. I'm here, Divine.
Okay, Catherine is right here. Thank you. It's great to see you 3, and thank you for agreeing, to launch this series. Just to introduce Lucy Kirkling, is Senior Lecturer at the Institute for Social Anthropology and Center for African Studies at the University of Basel in Switzerland. She's also co-founder of the Omudili Foundation, and she has a wide-ranging expertise in areas such as governance, political science, political transformation, and urban politics, and has mainly done work in East Africa with publications which include social capital corruption, an analytical spotlight of some messy boundaries in Switzerland and beyond. I did study with Lucy at the University of Basel. She is a long friend, and it is good, to have you on board this seminar and the launch of this discussion today. And then we have Catherine Toure, who is Regional Director for Eastern and Southern Africa for Canada's International Development Research Center, and who is helping to implement the Idrc Strategy 2030 for a more inclusive and sustainable world. Catherine has led initiatives to leverage educational technologies and internet business solutions to address information asymmetries and promote collaboration and learning across multiple boundaries. And she did study political science and African history and education at 3 universities in France, Cote d'Ivoire, and Canada. And just to say that Catherine is also a really strong supporter of knowledge production on the continent. And I knew her, I've known her also for several years. And then we have my friend and brother, Carl Amandlan, who is very big philanthropist and has worked in several sectors. He works in the intersection of public, private, and civil society sectors. He is the chief operating officer of EcoBank Foundation, and I think he's moving up again to do bigger things in another space. And he's responsible for the bank's social impact engagement and communities in which he operates in Africa. And prior to his current position, he led public-private initiatives to support an African response to Ebola in West Africa. He is a Mo Ibrahim Fellow and has been at the Economic Commission for Africa, where he had his Mo Ibrahim Fellowship. And he's also hosts a Master's in Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School in the US and Aspen Institute New Voices Fellow. He's also a really big writer, and he's won many awards, you know, as Africa Person for the Year for, you know, philanthropy and many initiatives. So thank you too for being here. We are going to start off with Lucy, and then after Lucy, we'll move to Catherine. And then after Catherine, we'll end with Carl, and then Kweku is going to coordinate the discussion. And we are looking forward to you to launch this new series. So over to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Divine, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. Thank you to Huma, thank you to all the organizers. I may tell you that this idea of ethical humanitarianism has already sparked some discussions in our foundation and beyond, thinking a little bit more critically and sharper about what that may mean. And I'm hoping that this conversation will go well beyond the panel and the inspirations that we get from this panel. But before we launch into the discussion, allow me to outline some of the values and principles underpinning the Fondation Umudili. Because I have to say we are probably a mouse amongst elephants here, because we're a tiny little foundation based in Switzerland, but have, thanks to Noemi Steuer, whom this first panel is dedicated to, have thought quite carefully about some of the principles along which we would like to engage. So the Fondation Umudili was founded about 6 years ago, and is very much shaped by Noemi's firm conviction that one of the fundamental structural injustices is the imbalanced representation and validation of knowledge emanating from Africa, as opposed to knowledge coming from the West. So the foundation has set itself the target to address some of these injustices, albeit in a very modest and, as you will see, quite personal fashion too. Now, inspired by Noemi, actually, the foundation actually understands knowledge in a very encompassing and inclusive way. So firstly, we seek to support the body of academic knowledge produced in Africa by collaborating with teachers, with young career scholars, and with academic institutions in Africa through stipends, through research grants, or summer schools. One of the cornerstones of our work is to facilitate the production and exchange of scholarly knowledge in Africa, particularly in the social sciences, as well as supporting knowledge networks across people, institutions, and continents. We maintain very close relationships with our counterparts, usually building on collaborations that go far beyond the actual activities that the foundation finances. And I'm more than happy to speak later about the specific activities. But secondly, coming back to our approach to knowledge, we also understand artistic expressions and representations as vital forms of knowledge, in particular the visual and performing arts. Here we collaborate with theatre companies and photographers in Africa, with a particular emphasis on supporting spaces of encounter, of exchange, of creativity and creation within and across countries, regions and continents. So for instance, we support spaces in a quite literal sense in form of houses in which artists, actors or photographers can meet in open-ended ways, for instance in Bamako or in Bujumbura. Or in a more overarching sense, recently in a collaboration between different photographers and theatre companies in East and West Africa, resulting in a dynamic production of photographs, ideas, theatre productions, as well as an exhibition which will also be shown in Europe. And in fact, we are trying to move away from the separation of these different forms of knowledge. And together with our counterparts, we're looking into how one can destabilize these boundaries and create new and hopefully far more inspiring and relevant interactions, drawing on as well as creating all sorts of different forms of knowledge. And in this, we also hope to be collaborating with humour in future. Let me just close with some thoughts on how we maybe approach what is called ethical humanitarianism, and how I think we would hope to engage with this concept as well. So our work is based definitely on an ethical dimension. So we are very aware of the fact that, you know, to all intents and purposes, we are a donor. And through that very fact, we are part and parcel of an unequal, skewed relationship in terms of financial power. But at the same time, we are deeply committed to endeavouring to render this relationship more equitable and fruitful and productive through collaboration and transparency. We work mainly within networks, many of which grow from trusted and established relations. And in that sense, we neither seek to create something that does not already have its roots and oxygen in Africa, nor do we seek or hope to impose our own conditions and definitions on that cooperation. On the contrary, we try very hard to tap into a dynamic exchange in terms of ideas and inspiration. And we hope that the Foundation's resources contribute to fostering, but not defining, fertile living spaces of articulation and agency. We also have a political dimension. We focus on supporting the production of knowledge in Africa and by African actors, because we have a political agenda, which is, albeit in a very modest way, to address and redress the invisibility of African knowledge, both in terms of intellectual as well as artistic expressions and manifestations. However, we do not see this in isolation. So we don't just see this in Africa, but we are thoroughly convinced that we are living in a global and globalized world within which it is precisely the dynamic exchange, interaction, visibility, friction, irritation, and ultimately understanding across different viewpoints and action points that allow for a constructive, productive engagement with what may constitute ethical humanitarianism or humanitarianisms. And I think that is a debate and a dialogue and a conversation to be had. It needs to be discussed, tossed around, as well as treated very preciously. And perhaps we realize that more so now in the age of a global pandemic. So just as a final sentence, the Fondation Umudili hopes to create not more divides. On the contrary, we hope to help open up flows and interactions across boundaries, providing buoyancy and visibility to different expressions of knowledge. So thank you again for inviting me to this conversation, and I'm very excited to be part of this much broader dialogue as well.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for that introduction. We are going to move straight to Catherine Touré, who is going to help us to contextualize ethics. Catherine.
Thank you, Divine. And our hearts do go out to people in Cape Town after the fire. It's absolutely heartbreaking. We know some lecturers have lost their homes. We know other lecturers are hosting students in their homes. So courage to everyone as we get through this. Kwaku, Divine, merci beaucoup pour la musique de Ousmane Tal. C'était absolument super et ça nourrit le cœur. Lucy, this is the first time I'm learning about Fondation Umudili, so I will be following this in the future. Thanks for your words about the dynamism in the relations that in which you engage and that you nourish. And Carl, I have always had an EcoBank account when I lived in Cote d'Ivoire, when I lived in Mali, when I lived in Senegal. Now I'm in Kenya. I would have opened an EcoBank account here if I had opened one, but I just have money transferred to my husband's account and he sends it to me on M-Pesa. So keep up the good work at EcoBank Foundation. Colleagues, ethical humanitarianism sounds a little highbrow for me. So let me just talk about something I know about, which is research ethics. I'll draw on 8 years of experience working at Canada's International Development Research Centre, supporting researchers in the Global South. Currently, we support 340 organizations across Africa. And a word just about what research ethics are. Research ethics have to do with respecting the rights and dignity of people, not doing harm, and ensuring community participation in research and benefits to communities where research takes place. Context, and Lucy alluded to this, is dynamic and plays a role in determining ethical considerations. Tensions exist. How do we ensure that dominant voices, including those of researchers and funders, respond to contextual realities and relations rather than dictate ethics to those they research and fund? So I will speak about IDRC principles on research ethics, examples of research on research ethics, and I find this very exciting. I hope I get you excited about research on research ethics, and how we at IDRC learn about ethics from African organizations. I argue that research ethics need to continually be contextualized in a dynamic world. So at IDRC, we established an advisory committee on research ethics called ACRE to guide center employees and promote staff training in research ethics. Our corporate principles on research ethics are on our website, and they have to do with respect for people, animals, and the environment, concern for welfare of participants in research processes, and the need to treat people fairly, equitably, and with dignity. So the research we support endeavors to adhere to universal concepts of justice and equity while remaining sensitive to the cultural norms and practices of the localities where the research is carried out. Our principles do not exhaust all ethical concerns, but they guide us. In contexts where there is no official institutional or national research ethics body, IDRC suggests that research teams set up an ethics committee for the project. In Southern Africa, and people who live in South Africa know more about this than I do, but leaders of the San peoples are convinced that most academic research on their communities has been neither requested, nor useful, nor protected in any meaningful way. Thus, in 2017, the South African San published the San Code of Research Ethics. It requires researchers intending to engage with San communities to commit to 4 central values: fairness, respect, care, and honesty, as well as to comply with a simple process of community approval. To continually deepen understanding of ethics, as I said, IDRC funds projects specifically on ethical questions. For example, the University of Cape Town is exploring tensions in private sector or industry-funded research when commercial interests may be at odds with development goals. The results will inform learning modules and toolkits on managing conflict of interest in ethics review committees and institutional review boards. Some of you may know that Wits University in South Africa, in collaboration with the Southern African Research and Innovation Management Association, SARIMA, offers an 8-week course on research ethics and integrity with professors from South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Nigeria. Those who take the course are expected to learn to articulate the philosophical and moral principles of ethics, resolve ethical problems in decision-making, apply scientific integrity and publication ethics, support research protocol development and good clinical practice, and finally, help sustain a culture of research ethics. In the Middle East and North Africa, 3 teams funded by IDRC seek to strengthen the application of research ethics. One team is mapping research ethics processes in the social sciences. Another, which includes Berzet University in the West Bank, is drawing on case studies to produce contextually relevant research ethics protocols in social sciences, public health, and humanities research. A third team is reaching out to young scholars to get their perspectives on ethics. The Science Granting Council Initiative, SGCI, brings together 15 national councils in Africa that make grants for research. Council staff meet regularly to learn from each other, plan transnational collaborations, and advance African leadership in science. In March 2021, so last month, SGCI hosted a seminar on ethics and integrity in research and innovation in Africa. The Sinovent Center, a think tank in Kenya, commissioned a paper for the webinar, which will be published soon. The participating Research Council representatives noted the need for training of researchers in research ethics and ongoing learning to enhance the application of best practices. They stressed that organizational ethics and integrity guidelines and standards need to reflect socio-cultural contexts and be adapted over time as situations evolve. There was also discussion, and I'm sure this doesn't happen at the University of Cape Town, there was also discussion about identifying and preventing academic bullying, an important but ignored factor in science's backyard. Academia needs to be intentional about cultivating environments where collaboration is promoted and bullying is called out. As part of the work on research ethics with African science granting councils, I wanted you to know that the Association of African Universities is collaborating with the African Academy of Sciences to fund participatory studies across the continent on research ethics. This work promises to inform researchers and communities, as well as research ethics committees and research funders in Africa and beyond. And now I talk a little bit about the work that young people at IDRC do. Every year, IDRC hosts a dozen young research awardees, some of whom conduct research on research ethics. In 2021, a research awardee working with the home-based care program of the Rwanda Biomedical Center is researching ethical issues around the use of a new mHealth tool, which is part of Rwanda's public health response to COVID-19. The work will support Rwanda's institutional review boards to create an ethics framework regarding home-based or remote care of patients. The research questions have to do with ethical conduct, patient and health provider influence on the evolution of the approach and tools, and equitable access to care. A 2018 research awardee researched the ethics of conducting adolescent reproductive health work with Syrian refugee girls in Jordan. The researcher found the need to consider cultural norms about reproductive health, respect autonomy and rights, and analyze power relations, including with donors. The research showed how some girls were coerced to participate in studies and were over-researched. The researcher recommended richer ethics curriculum and training for researchers, enhanced public and participant ethics awareness, age-specific ethical guidelines, and increased supervision of ethics. Research on research ethics is important. Research methods are also important. My question is whether participatory methods can help close the gap between research participant, researcher, and funder. At IDRC, we depend a great deal on our grantees to learn about ethical issues. For example, Just Associates in Southern Africa, working with the African Gender Institute, developed a feminist participatory action research ethics and security protocol. The protocol was developed in the context of research on strengthening women's voice, power, and safety to address gender-based violence in Malawi and Zimbabwe. According to the protocol, ethics are not just rules, regulations, and laws, but rather good practices to be observed during research. The implementation of the protocol helps ensure that research participants are protected from potential harm and that unnecessary and unwanted pain and suffering are avoided or alleviated. It suggests processes for listening and responding to each other on the terms of the research participants. Ethical decisions during research are often difficult, and this is why the participatory action research is guided by ethics which are based on care for self, others, and the whole environment in which the research is taking place. The protocol promotes participation and inclusion by those who will be impacted by the research. It proposes a power analysis to expose existing power dynamics and try to ensure those power dynamics are not reproduced in the context of the research. This includes an analysis of who is funding the research and how the research problems and objectives are determined. One last point before my conclusion. Research has for a long time been conducted both in person and virtually. Poorbita Sengupta and Megan Douglas, two IDRC colleagues and former research awardees, in a forthcoming paper, use a lens of decolonizing knowledge to address the ethics of researchers in the Global South, conducting virtual research funded by organizations in the Global North. What are the implications of greater physical distance between researchers and communities where research is conducted? How do researchers and funders remain connected to changing contexts? How do all actors question existing hierarchies of power and production and knowledge production? The forthcoming paper proposes that a feminist decolonizing framework can help address power differentials because it considers the ways in which power is reproduced, acknowledges different forms of understanding, and recognizes that everyone is a holder of knowledge. Conversations about and actions to decolonize the production and use of knowledge are critical ethical issues, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement becoming a global phenomenon. In conclusion, research ethics are important to ensure that participants in research processes are respected and protected, and that research benefits the communities in which it takes place. Research ethics are evolving conceptually, for example, in regard to decolonizing knowledge and development. They are evolving practically, for example, by being participatory instead of extractive. And the augmented use of digital tools may also raise new kinds of ethical issues. Research ethics are rooted in dignity for people and society. They need to account for power relations in different contexts and be negotiated. Research on research ethics is necessary to highlight existing and emerging ethical dilemmas and inform practice, protocols, and curricula on research ethics. Discussion of ethics, like at today's webinar, is also part of the process of promoting ethical practices in research and the meaningful co-production of knowledge. And I would just like to thank my colleague, Angela Baya, and other IDRC colleagues who contributed content to a paper prepared for today's webinar, which paper should be available by the end of April on my LinkedIn. Thank you so much. Looking forward to the ongoing discussion today and going forward over the next 9 months.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for talking about research ethics. Just to note that HUMA has an ethics working group and an ethics board, and that we are also preparing to launch a new journal on research ethics in Africa called Ethical Quandaries. Amandlan, over to you.
Thank you, Divine. Speaking after Lucy and Catherine, that have grounded the conversation into deep thinking and research is a bit of a difficult task. But as a non-academic, when I think about these issues, I first think about what values do we want to ensure that we maintain in a very complex and unpredictable environment. The value of humanity, of impartiality, of independence and neutrality. If we take these four, we will always be challenged because by default, we cannot maintain all four. It is not possible to maintain all four for a number of reasons. But I'll give an example. The first time I heard about the concept last mile, reaching the last mile, I was very enthused by the idea. Then at some point I asked myself, do the people living in rural areas think of themselves as being at the last mile? And probably not, because in most cultures, we usually migrate from rural areas towards the city. But we have accepted that the city has become the first mile, which is an interesting concept in terms of development. And what does this mean in terms of the values that I mentioned, in terms of humanity, impartiality, independence, and neutrality? In that particular context, we realize that we have absorbed concepts that might be foreign to the environment in which we operate, but sort of defines the way the funding has been allocated and how we think that we need to resolve certain issues. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to be able to ask ourselves a question in terms of the purpose. And if we see individuals in rural areas as being the last mile, do we associate and allocate, the same amount of resources for their transformation? And by transformation here, we don't just think about fixing the health element, ensuring that they have malaria treatment, or fixing the access to clean water. But we think of the whole as a development continuum. And if I'm in a rural area and the road is going to be built, or a factory is going to be built, what does it mean and what are the implications for this community to grow, to prosper? And as we start to think about those elements, I think there are probably three entities that are important, which are basically where I try to position myself: public, private, and civil society. The intersection of these three areas are extremely important in this debate because they come from different angles, with the non-governmental organizations having sort of they rose to prominence at a time when funding towards government was less and less because of the whole question around probably democracy and trust. But what are the implications of creating non-governmental organizations when, with COVID-19, we realized that it was the strength of governments that allowed the resilience of the system to continue? My home country of Togo, for example, put in place a system called Novici, which gave individuals in the informal sector a possibility to receive a basic income. This didn't happen before, but it is because the government has invested in resources, convinced the private sector and the civil society to work together, that there was a solution that was provided. So in this sort of complex and unpredictable environment, how do we ensure that the end in mind is always and often the improvement of society as a whole? Granted that some parts will probably accelerate further than others. In the context of the African continent, the majority of Africans live in rural areas. And what are the implications when we're thinking about the role that we play in urban areas, in thinking about those ideas, and what is their role? Catherine mentioned the example about the San people that probably didn't know that they were being studied. And then suddenly their stories are being told and written about them, maybe with their consent, maybe not. But is it impartial? Is it independent? Is it neutral? And where is the humanity in that? So as we think about these issues around development, transformation, philanthropy, or CSR, these are all constructs of a system that we either embrace or not. And what are the challenges of not embracing the system is where it's sort of the current. And thinking about that example about the last mile, how many will be able to stand and say, you know what, I don't want to do anything that has to do with reaching the last mile because I don't believe that this is the last mile. You will probably face some challenges because the narrative that has been written is about reaching the last mile. So if you have one or two people that say, you know what, I don't want to do this, then you ask them, you're probably not going to get the funding. Your voice is probably not going to be heard. And what are the implications of those voices not being heard in what we're trying to resolve? And my final point will be around in defining this environment or this ecosystem. Do we often pause to think about the core capabilities of institutions? So today you're hosting us because the core capability of institutions is about knowledge generation. But other institutions have different core capabilities. And this is what we've tried to do here at the EcoBank Foundation, is to ensure that what we do is as close as possible to the core capabilities of the financial institution that this foundation is aligned to. Because if we don't, it will be a nice story read in the annual report, but it will not engage with 14,000 employees. And does this mean that we have used our humanity as best as possible? We have been impartial, independent, and neutral in the way we're doing things? Those are questions that I think will continue to be the challenge as we engage in this environment because it is complex and it is unpredictable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. We are going to hand over to Kwaku, who is going to continue with the conversation. Just to note that we have my boss, the faculty Dean of Humanities, Shosta Kesi, who is in the group, and Francis Nyamjo, who is the chair of our academic board, is also in the group. And also we have speakers the next sessions like Jess Albert and also others such as Ines, who are also in the chat group. And it's a great time to begin this conversation. Kwaku.
Yeah, thank you, Divine. And thank you very much, Lucy, Catherine, and Carl. And I think the discussion so far has really set the pace for the entire 9 months and beyond. And actually, you see that listening to the speakers, one major factor that we can recognize is how the element of humanitarianism and values actually seems to sometimes contradict each other, come together. And these are the points that we are very much looking forward in discussing throughout the sessions. Thank you very much once again. And to all of us out there, now is the time to pose your questions. And welcome again to all the students that are joining from the Fredensaal University and the faculty that are also here. Please, if you have a question, just raise your hand and then we'll quickly call you and then you can pose it to any of the, I think perhaps I will start with the first question to all the panelists. I mean, Carl talked about the last mile and looking at or mentioning some of these core values as it's supposed to be, impartiality, independent, neutrality, and humanity in this context. And we had Lucy talking about the core principles of her organization as well as Catherine bringing in the aspect of ethical research into the discourses. Now, let me ask for the panelists, in your daily activities, whether being focusing on values and what your organizational values are, or looking at the core principles as in addressing your work, what are some of the main practical ethical issues that you usually have to deal with, especially when you are partnering with people with different ethical understanding? I mean, for example, going into the field doing research, or an organization trying to fund another organization. With these values and principles, do you find those that the values are closer to yours, or you find those that the values are far? And with Carl as well, I mean, if you are unable to converge these core values or principles, impartiality and independent, humanity and neutrality, what do you do then? how do you practically deal with some of these conflicting quandaries in your daily experiences? Any one of you can take, yes.
Yeah, I have one advantage because I work for a financial institution, which is
good.
There are certain things that would be very hard for me to go into. But the first element that we focus on is which organization can complement our skills. And one example, we're working with an advocacy think tank based in Senegal called Speak Up Africa. And they are complementing the skills of the financial institution in advocacy for malaria. We understand some of the elements, but we don't understand all of them. So going back to my point around core capabilities, it makes a lot more sense to find an institution that complement the skills so that we're not actually challenging each other on how we're going to do the work, but we're finding ways to make it work. So when a financial institution like EcoBank partners with a civil society organization like Speak Up Africa, it means that both institutions have recognized the value of partnering and then looking at the values that are embedded into the delivery. So we shouldn't only think about the values of institutions, but we should also focus in terms of the values of those that we claim that we want to help. And how do we ensure that by this partnership, we actually achieve that? So that tension has to remain and be constant to ensure that we don't just focus on us as institutions, but actually what is this partnership going to deliver in the ground? Over.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Carl. Catherine and Lucy, if any of you, okay, I see Catherine's microphone on now. So Catherine, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kwaku. I can try to come in on that. At IDRC, we do try to invest in Southern leadership, but that doesn't mean that once in a while there might not be a grant that goes to people outside of or organizations outside of the global South. And sometimes, most of the time, like in the African context, we're investing in African organizations, but there can be other partners as well. So some of the issues that can come up can be related to a patent. There's a research produces, there's going to be a patent. Who's going to have that patent? There can be questions of publications, and that's why it's best that those things be talked about up front. If a paper is published, who's authoring that, under what terms, and was this discussed up front, and are the various contributions recognized, or do power dynamics come into play? Or the tension between, well, some people prefer to publish a paper to advance in the academy, and other people want to put more emphasis on using the research findings to advocate for change. So how do you find the balance there? Of course, you can do both of those, but how do you find the balance there? We have a livestock vaccine innovation program. So what if you have an organization in Africa that's working with another organization where there were protocols about technology transfer, and then the technology transfer that was written into the protocols isn't happening? Do you cancel the grant? Do you find another organization? I mean, these are things that we can deal with. And the last thing I would say is that we have a framework called RQ+, which just means Research Quality Plus. So IDRC, we've looked at a portfolio of projects that we funded around the world over a certain number of years and come up with, gosh, I can't remember if it's 7 or 8 criteria as to what constitutes quality research. And utility, I mean, sometimes the academy looks at publications to advance in your rankings, but we know from Research Quality Plus that, you know, it's not just how many papers or books a research process will produce, but what was the utility of that research to the communities in which it took place? So there are frameworks to measure these things, kind of like what Carl was talking about. And one of the other criteria that contributes to quality research is integration of concerns for gender and inclusion. And actually, even though we pride ourselves at IDRC as trying to unpack issues of gender and inclusion, if you look holistically across all the projects we funded, they don't score that so well on inclusion of gender and inclusion. But research has to be inclusive. If you leave half of the people out of a research project, you'll have a half-baked solution at the end. These are some of the issues we deal with on a daily basis. Thanks for the question, Kwaku.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Catherine. So Lucy, I think the last mile situation comes up, right?
That's reverse order. Thank you very much for the question. And I may just try and incorporate Francis Nyamjo's question too.
That would be great. I was going to ask him to speak it up.
I think it's a difficult question for us because we're such a small foundation. And so in that sense, we are not a highly professional, institutionalized setup, but the kind of work that we do is very much founded on collaboration and cooperation within networks which already exist. And in that sense, you know, it's a little difficult because the way that we see it is that we are actually co-creating something, whatever that may be, whether it's, you know, we may be enabling in terms of financing something, we may be cooperating in terms of, I don't know, theatre productions or something. But, you know, I wouldn't actually see us as, we don't engage in any work which we don't actually find interesting, both in terms of the actors as well as the product. And we don't see it as delivery, but we really do see it as production and creation. So that may be a little difficult. And in that sense, the ethics of our organization are very much our own personal ethics, because otherwise we do not engage in it. Having said that, I think, like I mentioned in the beginning, a panel such as this is a really important juncture within which we need to take a step back and see, you know, is this just talk? Is this just fluff? Or is this real in the sense of an equitable collaboration which we are hoping to foster and engage with? Or is it, you know, just the way we like to see each other? So again, thank you for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So I don't know if Francis, your question. So Francis' question was about, Francis, if you are there, can you ask your question again? I think Lucy really tackled it. Yes, please.
Okay. Basically, there are instances when our personal ethics differ with the ethics of our organization. And my question to the panel is if and when that happens, how do you reconcile them?
So, well, that's the question. So personal ethics, how do you reconcile it with and just very quick answers to that. So who's going to go first? Catherine?
While Carl is thinking about it, I can go ahead and come in, give you a little time, Carl. So for me, it's a matter of being comfortable in the margins. I think that every organization has people who are at the center, people who are in the margins, and we need all of that. We need the people at the margins to ask questions and sometimes encourage changes in certain directions. So I'm comfortable being at the margins. I think it's a very good place to be. And so the example I would give is that IDRC, the president asked me to be a member of the Gender, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. I hope I got the title right. So this was a working group to look at questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And after the world learned about the Black Lives Matter movement, we started, for example, a study group, or we don't call it a study group, we call it a reading and discussion group at our organization. It's a diversity and inclusion reading and discussion group. So in the beginning, maybe 20 people came, then 30, then 45 people. So the whole idea is to institutionalize and normalize discussions about unconscious bias, systemic racism, and such in spaces where we need to be talking about those issues in this day and age. And the working group has now been formalized into, it's been taken up into our strategy 2030. So the issues of gender diversity and inclusion, and there's now a more formal committee to take those issues forward. So short answer, being comfortable in the margins and continuing to connect as well with people outside your organization so that you can learn outside your organization and bring things to your organization and vice versa. I hope that's.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll add to Catherine's point that institutions don't have ethical issues. You know, individuals in institutions may have ethical issues. And I think we need to separate the two, because people will change, and maybe the values of this individual at this time may be perceived as unethical. But we need to separate the two. At some point in time, there may be elements that suggest. And to Catherine's point, the margins are also important, because you need people in the margin that are willing to kind of keep on reminding that maybe there's an alternative to what is being done, and be persistent in the way they do it. And I think we all have personal experiences of institutions that we worked with where we were challenged by the idea itself that we were helping recipients. And what does it mean to be helping recipients when, first of all, they may not have asked for it, but somewhere, somehow decided that this is the way to do it. And there's an evolution, because we move from recipients to partners. Because at some point also, there was a recognition that actually they are doing most of the work. Or in some instances, we completely forget about the fact that the clinic in the rural area, which is being used for the investment from the partner, was built by government, or was built by the community. And how do we account for that first investment that allows for the additional resources to be used? So I tend to think that these are opportunities to learn as individuals, as long as we keep on reminding ourselves of what are the values that we're willing to accept and what are those that we're not willing to accept. And at some point, if it really doesn't work, we have a right to walk away, but without necessarily breaking things in the process, because all these things are temporary, they're not permanent.
Thank you, thank you. And before we go on, let me just say, perhaps we're supposed to end at 7. It's 7 or 19 hours, and maybe we can just. There is one more question, so maybe you just give 10 more minutes for Daniel to ask his question, and then from that question we let the panelists answer and also give their closing remarks to that. So Daniel, if you are there, please go ahead with your question. Yes.
Yeah, so just to follow up to what we're discussing, I just wanted to find out, the first thing is, so if, for example, you're working with an organization and you as an individual have this conflict where, for example, monies are given to you to do research, and you're supposed to, for example, get into a hotel, have this expensive, luxurious hotels, and you're spending money that could be used, for example, for other things on yourself, for example. How do you deal with this conflict, knowing well that, for example, the donor or whatever will be asking you for these receipts and stuff like that in order to account for these monies, when you know, for example, perfectly well, these monies could be used for better use in helping the people you're trying to look at. And then my final one is to ask, we also need to understand and also need to find out, why are people trying to sponsor, for example, researches that are taking place in Africa? So what are the underlying factors? What is being done with the information that is being generated and all the discussions that are coming up? What really is being done with these things?
Daniel, there is another Daniel Bendix. Daniel is also there, and he also has a question. Daniel, will you add your question to it? So, because I think it goes in a similar line, please go ahead and ask your question as well, and then the panelists will take it together.
Yeah, thank you. Just when you, Catherine, presented on your work, it came to my mind, like, how do we deal with situations in which the research that we do is done with people that actually do harm? To whom are we responsible then? I was thinking of, you also mentioned, I think, gender-based violence. You don't necessarily do the research only with those that experience it, but also with perpetrators, and maybe also with institutions that sort of support gender-based violence. And that for me makes it much more difficult, because we always seem to take for granted that we do the research with people with whom we feel some sort of solidarity, which is not necessarily the case.
Thank you, Daniel. Catherine, Lucy, and Carl, we take these questions, and then you add your closing remarks to that. So I think overall, the questions are bordering on how to deal with these conflicting values and these issues that are present. And I think that's also one aspect of this session, these seminars, to actually focus also on how to practicalize some of these concepts, some of these everyday experiences, bring it into the discussion. So let me see. Lucy, can we start with you?
Of course, thank you very much. And I can be quite brief about this, because speaking with my hat of the Fondation Umudili, you know, because our work is based on relationships of trust, these questions don't really arise for us. I've just been thinking of it, you know, or about it as you've you know, brought up these questions. You know, how far does that trust go? If we work with researchers, for instance, or with theatre companies, you know, do they then go on with their own research or with their own production to create more harm or to do harm? We haven't really gone into that at all because of the trust, I think, and maybe that's a mistake, but it is also, I think, a real potential in creating much more open and undefined areas of collaboration. So that, I think, would be my hope for the impact of our work as well. And in that sense, also in terms of our ethics, to create more equitable spaces of exchange and knowledge production as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Lucy. Carl, what would be your closing remark and answer to the question?
I'll probably add one value to the ones that I mentioned earlier, which would be integrity. And that one is to do things where even when nobody is seeing you, because the example that is shared has to, in my view, has to do with integrity. In terms of my final thoughts on this is, let's continue to be interested in what others are doing, and continue to be knowledgeable about what others are doing, being private sector, civil society, academic, because that's when the intersection happens. This is where we can really think about humanity. But if we remain in our own silos and think that because we're sitting in the private sector, we have more resources, we're missing an important element, which has to do with intellectual capacity of the research institutions or of a university. And that doesn't really necessarily have a price. So my advice is really, let's embrace diversity and manage it properly.
Thank you very much, Carl. Catherine?
I'm not sure I'll answer directly both questions of the Daniels, but I would mention something about this whole idea of safeguarding, which I think has garnered more attention when there's been attention to abuses. And I would just point you to some of the materials of the Ford Foundation, for example. They've explored in depth by case studies and their own experience. For example, you're funding an organization and then people in the organization are talking about alleged sexual abuse. So what do you do as a funder? So the Ford Foundation has explored that and has case studies on that. If there's cases of wrongdoing at IDRC that we know about, we have ways to report that and it will be investigated. But I think one of the Daniels was saying that it's maybe even wrong for program officers to be spending money on a hotel, for example. So I won't go into that. I think we need a little more time to explore that. Working with, I think it's also an ethical issue to use an intersectional lens. I mean, okay, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, but we all have such complex, intertwined and overlapping identities. So when we do research and we look at just men or women without looking at so many other factors, we're being maybe superficial and sacrificing the quality of the research and the utility of it as to what we can understand and and how it can benefit communities in which the research takes place. So I advocate for us understanding more about what using an intersectional lens is and how to unpack our multiple and recognize our multiple layers and identities as humans. So maybe my closing remarks might be a little bit similar to what Carl said. We always say that new knowledge is at the intersections of existing fields, but it was very interesting when he said, well, you know, our humanity is also at the intersections. So continuing to dialogue and to learn across multiple different kinds of boundaries, I think would be a good thing to do.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lucy, Catherine, and Carl. And ladies and gentlemen, I think we are bringing the discussion to an end. Divine will join me soon, yeah. But we have seen from today's discussion so far that the issue of ethics and humanity is not something that can be discussed in one sitting, in one session, right? It's an issue that we deal with daily, we deal with practically, we deal in every spheres of our lives. Our subjective judgments, our upbringing, our socialization are all factored into the way we approach these concepts and ideas. And that's why I'm very, very happy and honored that our panelists today have really done good and justice to the discussion today, to open up for the upcoming discussions that these sessions are going to bring. Divine, I think our time, they gave us 10 minutes extra. We are 2 minutes beyond that. I think we can now finalize it.
Yeah, we have to end. Just to thank everybody for staying and continuing. And thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, Carl. And just thank you, everybody, you know, for being here. And thank you, Usman. Usman is left, but we really thank you. This conversation continues. The next seminar or discussion in the series is next month on the 25th of May. And it will be on kindness, generosity, and compromises. We will be hosting Mahendra Shunmugan from the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, and Jess Albach from Northwest University. I can also see that there is Merlin in the crowd who will be speaking in the future, and many other colleagues. So really thank you, and we hope that you will continue to engage us further. Usman left us with one last song before we close, and we are going to close with that. So thank you, and have a good evening. Great. Thank you all, and see you next month. And follow us, on Twitter, on our website, and other activities. And thank you, panelists. Nice evening to you all.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.